Welcome to Unsafe Space. I'm your host, Carter Laren, and I'm joined, as always, by the bad mamma jamma, Keri Smith. Keri, unmute yourself and say something. No?
Hello, Carter. Something. Hi.
All right, good. Please don't forget to hit the subscribe button on YouTube. You might also want to go to unsafespace.com, since we'll probably be banned from YouTube as soon as they notice what's going on over here on our channel. Shout out to our Subscribe Star supporters. We're doing this show today because we have an opportunity to speak with Dr. Rachel Fulton Brown. We're very honored to have her on the show. Dr. Brown is an associate professor of history at the University of Chicago, where she teaches courses on the history of Christianity and European civilization. She's the author of From Judgment to Passion, Devotion to Christ and the Virgin Mary, 800 to 1200, and Mary and the Art of Prayer, The Hours of the Virgin in Medieval Christian Life and Thoughts. She blogs at Fencing Bear at Prayer on training the soul in virtue in the postmodern West. You can follow her on her YouTube channel, Fencing Bear at Prayer, on Facebook or on Twitter at @rfultonbrown. We'll provide links to all the ways to follow her work in the show notes. So with that said, Dr. Brown, welcome to Unsafe Space. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I think you've made me feel too safe. I'm not sure that's a great start.
Oh, you need to be a little bit more riled. I could call you here. I can redo the intro. Dr. Brown is a Nazi fascist, alt-right.
Oh, now I know where I am.
Feminist, right supremacist. I don't know. Misogynist.
White feminist. They say white feminist. That's
white feminist. I think that was Keri. Yes, that was actually the place it started. That I was praising European culture, so that made me a white feminist.
Which is a pejorative.
Bad? Oh, that's bad?
Yes, that's bad.
Oh, I'm so behind. I didn't even know a white feminist was a bad thing. So I'm excited to talk to you about, I know this sounds geeky, but I'm excited to talk a little bit about the Middle Ages because I don't know much about it. And I want to talk to you about Milo. But I think maybe the best way to start this discussion is for maybe you to talk a little bit about the blog post that kind of started it all, the 3 Cheers for White Men blog post, and what you were saying there, and how that turned you into a fascist, Nazi, horrible person.
Well, I think I turned into a fascist, Nazi, horrible person by standing still, right? That what I was saying in 3 Cheers for White Men was meant to be a pushback against the decades of criticism about teaching the work of dead white European males as part of our college curriculum. And so when I made the post and I gave it that title, it was simply to point to European culture and to say 3 cheers, because European culture and the cultures that have grown out of it, including the United States and Australia and New Zealand and Canada and other nice places in the world to live that have, for example, carried certain British institutions, have a respect for women and a support for women that is worth celebrating. So I said 3 cheers for chivalry, for consensual marriage, and for the right to vote. And somehow, when I was younger, those were considered good things. Apparently now they're controversial.
Yeah, you specifically said in the just so people know, the things you were talking about where it's like chivalry leading to the idea that rape is bad, that perhaps men shouldn't rape. The second one being, what was the second one? Oh, marriage not being a forced thing.
Yeah.
Being
right.
That women
sacramentally, both the man and the woman say I do, and that I do is a signal of consent, and that is a theological development of the 12th century. It's a medieval insistence that women have the right as Christians under God and as human beings to affirm whether they want to be married or not. And so it's giving women the strength to stand up to their own families, in effect.
And the third one was the right, men voting for women to have the right to vote. And I have to say, when I read your post, I think that's how I first came across your writing, was the controversy. I had never really heard someone put these things in positive terms before, because I'm so used to being from the social justice world where we only ever talk about our history as being horrible and terrible, and the things that that Western civilization has wrought, as being something, we talk a lot about slavery, but we don't talk about ending slavery, that we ended slavery.
Well, and the idea that Western civilization has been bad for women is a fantasy of Western civilization. I mean, it to a certain extent, it's Western civilization's continuing capacity to raise the bar on itself, right? That we have over the centuries, and it depends on how you tell the story, whether you start it with ancient Greece and Rome, whether you start it with the conversion to Christianity, whether you start it with the 12th century. But over the centuries, Western civilization has continually critiqued itself and raised the bar on its own sense of virtue and appropriate institutions. And so that we reached the point where now, we have this sense that women should have an absolutely equal participation in the society. Well, that is itself a development out of centuries of recognizing that women had equal status as creatures before God with men. So it's a sort of funny. I say on my homepage, my academic homepage, that one of the things I try to study is the way in which the ideals by which we critique ourselves are a product of this tradition. So that you, as a previous social justice warrior, are used to critiquing the civilization. Well, that's part of the culture too, right? That we are always holding ourselves to a very, very high standard.
It's that introspection that seems unique to Western civilization, just as a culture, that you don't see in a lot of other cultures. Certainly Islam doesn't have a lot of introspection, for example.
No, Islam has a completely different institutional structure. It has a completely different sense of the human being and of the human being's relationship to God. It has a very different relationship to art and therefore creativity. All of these things are if we know, one of the worst things that, as one of the kind of ironic blowbacks of Christianity is that in going into the mission field, Christians expect to need to learn the perspective of the people that they're talking to. And one of the effects of that is over many centuries, Christians coming in contact with pagans or peoples of other traditions have exercised themselves to understand, what is it Buddhists think? What is it Hindus think? What is it Muslims think? And have often seen great virtues in those traditions. One of the texts that I was teaching this past spring in a course I do on medieval travel is a very famous book from the later Middle Ages called The Travels of Sir John Mandeville. I say it was famous. It was copied many, many times in the later Middle Ages, and was one of the books that Columbus was familiar with in sort of searching for a different route to Asia. And the way Mandeville talks about other religions is, there are other Christian traditions that have their own virtues and are devout in their prayers, even though they may differ in certain points of doctrine from Catholics. But when he has conversations with a caliph in Cairo, he shows the way in which the caliph or sultan, the sultan is, in Cairo, is virtuous by his own law, right? And he, even in the book, Mandeville has the sultan criticizing the Christians, saying, you have the better tradition, but you don't even live by it. Mandeville says similar things about a Hindu ritual that he describes that he calls the Juggernaut. It's actually a festival of the Jagannatha, which is interesting, that writing in the 14th century in England, he seems to have known about this ritual, and that it was a great statue of Shiva that was carried on a cart, and as part of their devotion, the people would slash themselves with knives and make their blood flow, and sometimes he thought on purpose, but it's apparently by accident, they would fall underneath the wheels of the cart and be crushed, right? And he's saying these people have more devotion to their idol than many Christians have to Christ. That this sort of recognition of the significance and power of other traditions is part of the Christian tradition. And so it's ironic that has kind of flipped over in the last 100 years or so, to the point where Christians aren't even confident of their own tradition anymore. They're so determined to make sure that they accord other traditions with the proper respect. So all of the critiques that are brought against the West and Christianity by the social justice warriors are themselves Christian in root.
Right. And they seem to conflate recognizing that there was value in Western civilization with denying that there are any flaws ever in Western civilization. So as soon as you say something positive about something that happened, it's almost as if you said nothing ever bad ever happened, and that's how they react to you.
Yes, they're the ones that are thinking in these ridiculous Manichaean terms, right? There's either pure white or pure black, right? There's either, perfection or evil. And of course, in the Christian tradition, the expectation is, well, one, that human beings are not perfect. We are fallen and sinful. And that, we're called to strive in virtue in our lifetimes. Very few do so perfectly. And those the Catholic Church recognizes as saints, but even, the saints are not necessarily perfect. They're just holy. So it's an interesting impulse that the social justice warrior pseudo religion has developed, that unless you are absolutely perfect according to their description of virtue, you are a Nazi.
It makes me think of, I'm sure you've heard the term splitting used in psychology, where the tendency to view people as like either all good or all bad. I've thought about that before, that like people with, I think that's one characteristic of borderline personality disorder, which is like a disorder of the emotions, is that tendency to want to look at everyone as all good or all bad. And I've thought about that a lot in terms of how it relates to like my old belief system and the way that they reduce people to those things.
It's a good point. I was just going to ask Dr. Brown if you think, from the outside, I look at I was never a social justice warrior, so I don't have Keri's perspective, but from the outside, I look at it and, I've read the Antifa handbook, and I've familiarized myself with some, many of their arguments, not as much as Keri has, but it doesn't actually seem like they're pushing for anything in particular, but against Western culture. The only foundational belief that I seem to be able to see consistently over and over again is that Western culture is horrible and evil and should be torn down. It's not even clear that they all agree on what should be replacing Western culture. They just seem to agree on any example of anything good about Western culture needs to be attacked. Is that completely wrong, or what's your experience there?
Well, it sounds to me like you know more than I do specifically about Antifa. I didn't realize there was a handbook. That that kind of purifying by destruction is, yes, it seems to me that I don't see anything that they consider to put in the place, because anything that they seem to argue for positively, I see typically as a perversion of the good that the tradition itself would uphold. So they seem on the whole to destroy beauty as a feature of their activity, right? So that they make themselves ugly. They want to break things and destroy things. They want to demonstrate the way in which our language is, incapable of expressing beauty, because anytime you say anything that is meant to be positive, they point out all the flaws in the world. I think it's ultimately, and I say this not really guardedly, but just advisedly, it's satanic. And it's satanic in the sense of against creativity, against the creation, and against anything that takes building up. And as human beings, we only make imperfectly. We are modeling ourselves on the creation of God, but we're always going to be inadequate in our creations. But that doesn't mean that what we do doesn't participate in that good, as we're striving to imitate nature, or follow the patterns that are given to us through revelation. So I do see that destructiveness of the left as literally satanic, in the sense that it's the enemy of creativity and making.
Yeah, it's the secular analog would be nihilism, it sounds like.
Right. Yes. But Satan is the enemy, right? And so if you think it's why is the enemy so dedicated to the destruction of the made, the created? And this I'm deeply influenced in my thinking about this by spending a lot of time reading Tolkien and teaching the course that I do on the Lord of the Rings, that Tolkien makes his Satan character Morgoth very clearly the one who tries to disrupt the project of creation. And of course, Iluvatar is able to turn even Morgoth's disruption into beauty. But the sort of premise of Tolkien's own art is the problem of both being jealous of the creator's work and of holding too possessively onto your own creations. And both of those are, you know, the definition of evil, in a sense, that they are trying to constrain other people in their own creativity and holding on to something at the expense of whatever sacrifice you might need to make out of love for, you know, caring for the world or you know, caring for people that you love.
Right. You've written about this kind of general pushback to even teaching Western culture. It's ironic. So I guess we should point out, it's a little bit odd that you were attacked for being the defender of Western culture when I guess several years earlier you were attacked for being the villain of Western culture, incorrectly, but still.
Right. They seem to get it wrong both times.
Yes. But you teach European civilization. I assume you still teach the European civilization course. And so you were attacked for not teaching the Western classics in the way that your mentor had taught them, which wasn't even your decision, it sounds like. And now you're being vilified for even supporting anything about Western culture, saying anything good about it. And you wrote an article about pushback, and you cited Stanford as an example of students pushing back against Western culture and having to learn Western culture at all. And they really seem to want to make all cultures morally equivalent. And I'm wondering if you can kind of talk about that for a minute, because you've talked about this too. People take our culture for granted. We take things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, innocent until proven guilty, private property. We take all these things for granted, and they're not normal historically.
Well, they're particular to our tradition, yes. Well, so what I said already about the way Christianity looks at other traditions and finds the good in them, with the understanding that there's, you know, evil is the utter absence of being, right? In Augustinian terms. So any religion, no matter how far removed from revelation, is going to contain good. So, you know, one of the most significant examples is the way in which Bartolomé de las Casas argued in the 16th century for the inherent goodness of the Native American religions, which included human sacrifice and cannibalism. And you can say, how could a Dominican be arguing in favor of human sacrifice and cannibalism, which are, you know, considered by most living people now particularly evil? And he said, well, because that was as good as the Incas and the Aztecs could get without revelation, right? It's like reason will get you to the point that you sacrifice the thing that is most valuable, and of course the human life is most valuable. And so it makes sense to a certain extent that the Incas and the Aztec would come up with human sacrifice as their highest religious ritual. Now, as a Dominican, he obviously wants to convince people that that's not what God wants. But, you know, he says from their perspective, it made sense. It's a similar sort of impulse in Western education generally that I mentioned John Mandeville and his interest in Islam and Hinduism. He has descriptions of Buddhists as well. He has descriptions of people's living in the around India and China. He has descriptions of China. The recognition throughout the Middle Ages that there were peoples outside of Christendom who were also human and who had reason. And if you came in contact with them as a Christian, you would also recognize as descended from Adam and Eve and creatures of God. So to me, the worry about, you know, teaching Western civilization and whether or not we learn about other civilizations as well has always seemed ridiculous. Right? Of course you're going to want to learn about other civilizations as well as the Western civilization. That's part of Western civilization, to be curious about all these other traditions. So when I was in college, it was utterly normal for me to say, well, I'm a religious studies and history major, and in religious studies, we had courses in Eastern religions as well as Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and ethics and postmodernism. And in my history degree, I did courses in American history, I did courses in medieval Europe, but I also did courses in China. And did I do some Latin American studies? Maybe early modern, and we read it. It's like by the end of it, you should want to know all of world history, right? There's one great human story that we have fragments of and pieces of, and you don't understand European history unless you're putting it in context with Mediterranean and South Asian and Eurasian history more generally. Obviously, the more you understand about the cultures that the Europeans came in contact with after Columbus, the better you understand, human behavior and so forth. It's just always seemed to me ridiculous to claim that if you're celebrating Western civilization, that means by definition you're denigrating all others. No, it's part of Western civilization to be curious and to want to have a full understanding of human behavior.
And even some empathy, it sounds like there's
and empathy as well, and empathy. And so that's in the you clearly, thank you, read fairly deeply in Fencing Bear, but there are several posts that have caught people's attention most widely. One was 3 Cheers for White Men. Another was the one that I did in response to the colleagues who were saying, if you don't declare yourself not a white supremacist, your students will assume you are if you teach medieval Europe. And I said, well, how to signal you're not a white supremacist? Learn some fucking history. Like
this is my favorite line.
I still want the t-shirt, right? if you actually do your job as a historian, you're going to find yourself tracing all of these stories, right?
Yep.
Because they all end up interconnected at some point.
Can I ask you something about, look, one of the things that I'm ashamed of in my life is I didn't learn history very well when I was in high school. It wasn't my thing. And now I'm dad, and I'm kind of like trying to tell my daughter history is really important, but I realize that I'm kind of a hypocrite because I didn't really learn it very, very well. But
well, you've got the right instincts. Let's work on how you solve that.
Yes. Well, I'll ask you some specific questions about that later. But one of the things that I think about with Western culture, a lot of people point to the Enlightenment, right? And that as kind of one of the seeds of a lot of Western culture. And then they back up and say, well, it's the Reformation that led to the Enlightenment. But you're the first person I've ever read that says, actually, it was the Middle Ages. And the Middle Ages, granted, is a huge time period. It's like 1,000 years. So
right.
I'm wondering.
It's a long development. It takes a while.
Can you tell us just really, I mean, I know, you could probably lecture about this for days, but just really briefly, can you tell us why is it the Middle Ages that you're pointing to as kind of the birthplace of Western civilization and a lot of the values that we take for granted?
Towns. It's the development of the towns. And I did a class last year on the importance of the towns. You realize what you're talking about when you talk about our government and our traditions of government. They're not, I mean, we in the 18th century that they like talking about how democracy came from Greece, but in fact what the American founders were drawing on were traditions of English common law in particular, and they develop out of the Middle Ages and the centuries of local consultative government on the basis of primarily in the towns, although the Anglo-Saxon law codes are fairly negotiated as well. But many of the structures that we depend upon in modern society develop in medieval Europe as consequences of charters that are given to towns, so that we think about things like liberty as this thing that everybody has, we say, as a right to. Well, in the Middle Ages, the right to liberty was an actual grant of the king or of the lord that gave you the charter for your town, right? So it wasn't a considered this God-given thing. It was actually politically, legally bestowed on the citizens of the towns. The kinds of representative government that we draw on in the United States and are modeled on Parliament are obviously also medieval developments, but it's also a culture of virtue and devotion and care for others in your community. And so, and that develops in the medieval towns, out of parish organization, out of the desire to build, the great cathedrals that you train all the artisans and craftsmen and so forth to make your own cathedral, because each town wanted it. Each of the cities wanted their own cathedral, or they wanted their churches. That we see the development of ideals of education throughout the Middle Ages, that you have both men and women wanting to learn to read, and schools set up for the children in the towns, and the idea that you take the best, most talented children from those schools and send them off to university. That's a medieval development. What I said in my 3 cheers about the recognition of women's status, that women throughout the Middle Ages in Europe have comparatively in human history an amazingly high status, including in the sense of respect that is meant to be given to women, modeled on the respect that you give to the Virgin Mary as the Mother of God. And therefore, in fact, the town is all centered on this image of Mary as, she's considered in the medieval devotions, the temple, the throne, the city where God becomes present. And what we talked about in my towns course was the way in which medieval cities are all modeled to a certain extent on the image of creation, right? They're sort of cosmic. Christianity is from its origins an urban religion. It's focused on a holy city, on Jerusalem. And the towns that develop in medieval Europe carry with them all of these registers, right? They're centers of legal and political development. They're centers of commercial and crafts development. They're centers of education and literacy, and they're centers of art and devotion and, the sort of higher contemplation. So what I now say is, like, to understand the significance of medieval Europe, you start with the great importance of the development of the towns. And that's why, Marx is actually so dangerous, because he's attacking the bourgeoisie. And guess who the bourgeoisie are? The townspeople. Right? All of the values that, those bourgeois values that you're, supposed to spit upon and consider repressive, they are the virtues and structures that enabled Europe to develop as it did.
Interesting.
Are you saying that it was the Christian religion that led to the towns, or was this coincidental and they happened to be Christian? Because don't you have towns? I don't know Chinese history very well either. I assume you have towns elsewhere in the world, but you really only had the Western culture develop, obviously, in Europe.
Well, I think, yes, of course, there are towns in other traditions, and I just taught a course this spring on religion and history, and we were reading a book, Stephen Protero's God is Not One, which was purporting to show, the difference between the 8 great religious traditions, 8 of the great religious traditions in the world. And we talked a bit about Confucianism, for example. Town life requires a certain development of character and virtue, otherwise people can't live with each other. And I that's why when I gave you my answer, I'm sort of layering it on a number of different characteristics, right? And this, I think, is, the propensity that certain, political actors on either side of the divide, as it were, whatever that divide means, have to reduce our culture to one or another characteristics, right? So I don't know what the social justice warriors say, but the conservatives will often say things like, well, it's our liberty, or it's our freedom, or it's, our justice, or it's this or that. Well, the reality is, to support any of those ideals, you need a very robust institutional structure. And that institutional structure developed in the European towns. So you can't, it's like worrying about whether or not, which part of you is most you. Is it your eyes? Is it your nose? Is it your hands? Is it your gut? Is it your feet? Right? You need all of it in order to be a fully functioning culture. And to pull out one or the other, say, well, it's the Christian towns in I say Northern Europe, it's Southern Mediterranean Europe also has significant developments that are important. And it's also the towns in contact with the Asian traditions that people like Mandeville were aware of. So trying to dissect it I think it's maybe the best metaphor is the one that Tolkien used when he's talking about scholars studying Beowulf as something that they were going to extract social history from, and it was like he said, it was like they found a tower, knocked it over to study the bricks or the stones that were used to build it, and then said, well, where'd the poem go? And I think that to a certain extent happens when people want to find the essence of Western civilization. It's another metaphor. It's like cutting open the ball to find the bounce that Tolkien used when talking about the way people study stories, right? You've cut open the whole and are wondering why you can't find what it was that animated it.
It's actually much more complex than and maybe difficult to define. I don't know. There's a quote in one of your articles that just really struck me, and if it's okay, I just want to read it because it's about this. And you say, because this is how I feel about medieval, right? As my professor of Byzantine history in graduate school used to love to tell us, medieval Europe was a backwater, a dump, the dregs of what was left after the Roman Empire moved east and all the legions left. European Christians spent over a millennium in the shadow of Dar al-Islam, always conscious of themselves as backward in scientific knowledge, lacking the access to the greatest markets, incapable of even following their own Lord's commandments as faithfully as they should. I ignored the parentheses, but you get the gist of that. It just seems so weird. That's how I think of the Middle Ages, and to think of that as the crucible from which, because I'm very grateful and appreciative of what we have in Western civilization, and to think about that being the crucible is kind of mind-blowing. I don't think I've wrapped my head around it yet. I got to study more.
Well, that's the post that's the unbearable whiteness of the West, right?
I think so.
I go on to quote Mandeville in that post, right? And
yes,
what I'm being a bit mischievous in that paragraph because I don't completely agree with Professor Garsoian. And the thing is, now the more I've done proper study since I wrote that blog post of the towns, and I have a much greater appreciation of how significant a development they had, particularly from the 12th century. Professor Garsoian's right for the earlier Middle Ages, but she's very, very wrong by the later Middle Ages. And that's, what you said, it's like the Middle Ages, we think of them as the single moment, but it's 1,000 years. So by the end of the Middle Ages, those towns that I've described for you have become extremely wealthy. They have highly skilled craftsmen. They have the people that are able to then launch Europe, out into its contact with the rest of the world, as it does in the 16th century, and either conquer a great part of it or develop significant trading relations with other parts of it. So Professor Garsoian was more thinking, I think, of the earlier period, that her focus was more the 9th and 10th centuries, and in those periods, yes, Europe was still to a certain extent a backwater, but we know now, thanks to the work of particularly Michael McCormick at Harvard, how significant the trading connections remain even throughout the earlier period with the East. So, it's easy to it's easy to diminish the accomplishments of any historical period by comparing it with now. But to recognize where our now came from, it's like the seeds of it were sown in Europe in the Middle Ages. You don't get to the Enlightenment without the 12th century. It's like worrying about.
You don't get to even the Reformation without the 12th century, I imagine.
Right. And another characteristic of Europeans has been, weirdly enough, to dismiss their own past. And the French try to do it with great verve in the Revolution, right? They start over the calendar and things like that, and try to destroy all the previous structures. But even they depend a great deal on what they'd been prior to that.
So in terms of like something you just said, that we like to destroy our past. In terms of where medieval studies is at now, I think a lot of people I know tend to write off the stuff that I have to say about what's happening at college campuses as like me being a bit hysterical about it. And so I was wondering, it seems to me as an outsider looking in and looking at the controversy that's been happening with you and this particular person, Dorothy Kim, and a lot of other academics who sort of ganged up with her to, in my opinion, bully and harass you and to do all the things they were accusing you of doing. It seems to me that the intent is to destroy the past, is to destroy the whole field, is to destroy medieval studies. Am I oversimplifying it, or like what is the state of medieval studies? Has it been completely converged upon by the postmodernists, by SJW ideology, or are you like the lone professor?
I am. So there were a few others that came to my defense, Richard Landis and Jane Chance,
okay,
very famously in Milo's article. You get to talk to me about Milo. We get to Milo eventually.
Oh, cool.
We will.
Please do. That I am the only one who, sort of ended up in the midst of the name calling, and I was a bit surprised at how few people were within my own field were willing to come out and say, wait a minute, this is a bit much. I don't know yet how much the field has been contaminated by this kind of scholarship. I know people are nervous, and not so much because of what I say, but that they're very nervous about saying, positively championing Christianity as the wellspring of many of our great ideals and values. Even people that work on Christianity were not willing to admit that was pretty much what I was trying to do, because the field has been quite anxious about acknowledging, ways in which, the relations to Christians, Muslims, and Jews in the period were tense, right? And it's interesting that in the telling of that, Christianity always comes off as the villain. When if you know the details of the stories, they're always much more complicated than the simple versions that people want to make you think. And from my perspective, it's relatively rare that the Christians are flat out the villains. They may make bad decisions in the way they behave on the ground at times, but for example, things like the Crusades, there's a huge debate that is sort of long running in the field about the degree to which the Crusades are considered a defensive or offensive war. Well, the reality is it's that the Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, was under attack. Alexius Comnenus, the emperor, asked for help in the way that the Byzantine Empire had for centuries. Going back to what Professor Garsoian would say, Constantinople always considered itself the center of civilization and everybody else barbarians. And some barbarians you allowed the princesses to marry, and most of them you didn't. It was okay to marry a Frankish princess. And indeed, in the 10th century, there was a sort of, minor princess married off to the German king, Otto II. So Otto III had a Greek mom. And that Alexius asks for mercenaries, in effect, and what he got was a bigger army than he meant to. And that, it wasn't even clear that army was supposed to go to Jerusalem, right? It layers and layers and layers and layers. And the thing you'll always hear about that happened on that campaign was that there were Jewish communities along the Rhine that were attacked. Well, they're not attacked by the main crusading force. They're attacked by a rogue count, Emico of Leiningen, who is roundly condemned by everybody else in the moment, and opposed by the bishops of the towns that he attacked, right? And the bishops in the German towns try their best to protect the Jews whom Emico and his thugs are coming after, and so forth, right? There's always more actors involved on the ground than the caricature version makes you think. And what I find curious is why scholars who know the complexity of those stories still seem to play up to the social justice version of things when they talk to the public.
Isn't, again, not being a historian, but my understanding now was that the Catholic Church felt like they were under attack from invading Muslim armies for 400 years or something, right? I mean,
it's going to be much more. How long do we have? I mean, things are different in Spain than they are in the Holy Land. I mean, it's true
Okay.
that the Visigoths are conquered by Muslim invaders. Those Muslims are conquered by later Muslim invaders who are conquered by yet more later Muslim invaders. I mean, even the Muslim occupation of the peninsula is complicated and changes over the centuries. In the Holy Land, so the Crusaders with the First Crusade go at the invitation of Alexius Comnenus to help him recover certain of his own cities, right, like Antioch.
right.
And the Crusaders besiege Antioch for 9 months. And lo and behold, Alexius doesn't send them the help that they think they should. And so at that point, they say, well, we're here on our own. And that they decide to go to Jerusalem. It's not really clear that their original intent was to go to Jerusalem. They capture that city. But irony of ironies, it's partly because the city had just the year before been captured from the Seljuks by the Fatimids. So by one group of Muslims from another group of Muslims, the Crusaders capture the city. And so there's Latins holding on to Jerusalem until 1187 when Saladin captures it. But after the first campaign, there is never a successful campaign to gain further territory. Every subsequent crusade is a failure.
Okay.
And the 1204 crusade captures Constantinople, which is complete misdirection. And all of the other campaigns don't capture any more territory, and they're very hard to sustain, and it's very hard to get enough manpower to even stay in the Latin kingdoms to protect them. From the Muslim perspective, these were border wars that made little difference, and they make almost no impression on medieval Muslim chroniclers. It's really only in the late 19th, early 20th century that Arab historians reading European accounts of the Crusades even come up with this idea that they're a concerted effort on the part of Christendom to, take over Islam. They never were.
Really?
Really.
It's a pretty recent narrative.
Yes, the Jonathan Riley Smith's Christianity, it's Christianity, Crusade, and Islam, or Islam, I can't remember the title exactly, but Jonathan Riley Smith has a wonderful little book that goes through the historiography and how the image of the Crusades that both Muslim historians and stereotyped Western accounts give is a 19th and 20th century invention. The medieval story is much more complicated.
Interesting. So you were saying you wondered why other professors kind of fall in line with this social justice view of the Crusades.
Mm-hmm.
But you did also, I mean, you've written a lot about the fear of speaking up. One of the things I like about your blog is that you're pretty open about your own psychology, and you'll write, I was afraid about this, I saw this, and like my heart, like heart palpitations, and should I sign this or not sign this or whatever. So you're pretty open about all of that. I mean, you write a lot about the fear of speaking up and social ostracism. I assume, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I assume basically they have the same heart palpitations you do, and for some reason they just didn't get over it.
For some reason they are, I think a lot of people are cowardly. They choose cowardice. And yes, I love the way that you're so open about, like, in these conversations when you're being attacked, how to like deal with the emotions that you're experiencing, the fear that you're experiencing. But see, what I love about you when I discovered the controversy and discovered your writing and stuff is that you are, in my opinion, you share your fear with people, but in my opinion, you are fearless in your actions. Like, you're just this badass professor who's like, I'm just going to try to, in my opinion, you seem to be someone who's like, I'm going to try and find and speak the truth and say what you will about me and do what you will, but I'm just a person trying to arrive at truth. And I don't think, again, I hate to keep going back to this controversy thing, but I don't think people realize how intensely you have been targeted. And like some of the stuff that has been said about you is just, this one ringleader in particular, I don't want to stay on her too much, but is she professor? What is her title exactly?
Professor Kim, she's assistant professor, and she's at Brandeis now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So she said in one of the posts about you, because she's just like relentlessly posting about you on these like Facebook groups or on Twitter. And I think last I heard you said that you're the person who shall not be named, but they're still talking about you.
After Milo's article came out last summer, they kind of had to discover yet other ways to not talk about me.
But it's so hateful. And one of the things she said, I mean, she said a lot of crazy stuff, but one of the things she said that just really jumped out at me was that your views are violence to her and her family, your views. And I'm like, that is one of the most dangerous things you can say, I think, about, it's like, because if your views are violence, then what's justified against you, Dr. Brown? Like, what you're being violent, so it's a really
right. And
that's,
I mean, she said that they talk in those vague terms, right? Because that's more terrifying. Milo, followed up on all of those accusations when he did the research for Middle Ages. He tried to talk to the police department at Vassar, where she was when all of this was happening 2 years ago. He tried to find out whether there was any evidence of any of these attacks that she claimed had happened. And of course there was nothing, because there never is, right? These are social media claims. They're not claims that seem to have any reality in terms of filing a report that there is some kind of actual threat made, because there weren't any.
Yeah, it always seems weird to me. Like if someone has done something, like a lot of people often claim, you don't post to social media, you go to the police. And
you go to the police.
Then shut the hell up, because you have no evidence.
Well, and the thing is, if she had received anything like that, the campus police would have responded immediately. I got a little note around last Christmas, tucked outside my office door outside in a little picture that was hung up outside the office door. It was a Pokemon, which I then sort of thought funny, because it was like I got my hate mail by Pokemon. And it, my first response was take a picture of it and post it on social media, and then Janice Fiamingo tweeted it for me too. And my second was, tell my dean and my chair and so forth. And the immediate response of the campus was to send an officer around to take a statement. Right. So if Professor Kim had ever received anything that, was even remotely considered actually a threat, where's the police report? It's the same thing that's obviously been done to Milo. That his simply pointing out some uncomfortable truths, such as abortion is murder, and that people that have gender dysphoria, it may be more compassionate to not start transition surgery when they're 3, and so forth. These issues that obviously make people very, very anxious and upset to talk about, need talking about. They don't go away as issues just because you start yelling at each other.
Yeah. Well, maybe this is the time to transition to Milo. I mean,
have we talked about the Middle Ages enough?
I can come back to the Middle Ages later. It's okay.
Okay. That's fine. We can, because once you start talking about Milo, you're not going to get me to stop.
Well, I can do one more Middle Ages thing, but it's a weak one, which is you drew a distinction in one of your articles about saying white culture did some things as being distinct from saying this culture did some things because they were white. Like, right. And that is a distinction that I think is critical, because to be able to say, well, white European culture did these great things, that's not being a white supremacist. That's not saying they did them because they're white. It's just saying, it's the same as saying, hey, Chinese people invented gunpowder. It's just a fact. It has nothing to do, assuming that's true. I don't know. That's my
They did. And
history.
then the Europeans turned it into weaponry.
Chinese people were busy having fireworks and fun with it, and we decided to make guns.
Right.
But it's not. That's not a racist thing to do. It's not a white supremacist thing to do, to point out good things that a certain culture has accomplished in the past. It's completely different to say they accomplished those things because they are white. And that's what everyone assumed. Not everyone. That's what the social justice, that's the brush they try and paint you with. When you say anything good about European history or European culture, they try and paint you with this brush to imply that you are saying that European culture is good because of skin color and race, when that has nothing to do with what you're saying.
Right. And that, that's another artifact of the 19th century, that there were definitely people in the 19th century that were arguing for the supremacy of the white race. That's undoubtedly true.
Yeah.
And the racism that was used in the United States by those who wanted to continue keeping slaves is indeed as ugly as people say, right? The kinds of arguments made that whites should be continuing to hold black people as slaves, definitely ugly. They're not medieval arguments. In the medieval sources, sometimes people are, sometimes I keep going back to John Mandeville because he's such a good example, right? He has a description of the Ethiopians as being black, and he says, they consider the blacker they are, the more beautiful they are. So they go out, they use preparations or something to make themselves look blacker. Next story, right? The best example also is all of the stories of the monsters that were supposed to live in Asia, which come not from the Middle Ages, they come from classical antiquity. And what's interesting about it is those monster stories are to a certain extent known across Eurasia, that the Chinese have similar monsters. But things that the ancient Greeks and Romans included in their natural histories, the people with one big foot that use it to shade themselves, or the people with faces in their chests, or the dog-headed people, and so forth. Medieval Europeans have stories about them, and the stories always have the valence that if they're human and rational, then they're descended from Adam and Eve, and you should try talking to them. So the medieval expectation of races was, one, it's just the different tribes of people, right? The nations or the race of the Anglos or the Saxons or the Frisians. And two, that, human beings can look a lot of different ways. They can have different skin color. They can have dog heads. They can have, they can wear clothes. They can be naked. All of them are human beings. And the humanity of God's creatures is recognized. Now, that over the course of the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, Europeans began to make arguments about why they were so technologically advanced, and proud of themselves for being able to, colonize so many parts of the world. Yes, that's the background of the modern racial arguments that then the post-colonial theories are trying to push back against. But that has nothing to do with the way medieval Europeans talked about themselves or other human beings.
That's fascinating. I had no idea about that history, because we just kind of always assume that, the Christian culture was always racist, because that's kind of what we learned.
That's the way we've been taught, but these are artifacts of much more recent history. Interesting.
Well, Keri, unless you have more, we can switch to Milo.
Yeah. So you wrote, just so I have the timeline right, you wrote the offending blog piece before you met Milo, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And
then it was Dean Ellison's letter that prompted your Milo connection. Is that correct?
It was, yes. So Dean Ellison wrote the letter about having no safe spaces at Chicago, and I was aware, because of the controversy that it had risen up about the 3 Cheers for White Men post, I was aware in January, February 2016 that Milo was out there giving talks, partly because another colleague, Alan Franson, was also attacked by this same group of social justice warriors. And he and I, in our conversations, he sort of said, have you heard about this Milo person? So when I in September 2016, when the letter went out from the deans, I was sort of curious, and I went and watched a number of Milo's videos and wrote to him then.
And then they really loved that you became friends with him.
That proof.
Yeah. You've had so you have a section on your blog that's all about Milo called the Milo Chronicles. Mm-hmm. And you have like an interesting view of the role that he is playing in society and pushing back against some of this stuff on campuses. And would you just want to get like a brief overview of what you think about Milo? Because he's been called so many things by so many different people. How would you, like, if you were to tell someone about Milo in a few, like in a paragraph, what might you say about him, his importance?
He understands the importance of laughter. And what I called him in that series of posts that my colleagues found most upsetting was a holy fool, in the sort of character of like St. Francis, who uses jokes to teach people moral lessons. And that in that sense that, what got people most upset about him was he was able to make fun of certain sacred cows and show how we didn't need to be afraid of making jokes about certain kinds of topics, and therefore open up the possibility of talking seriously about them in a way that we hadn't previously, but also to bring back the joy of celebrating our own culture and our own tradition. I mean, he was so much fun in the campus tour, because when he did his political speeches, and that was the election year, right? And he'd be just the students would be, one, applauding for Trump, and two, cheering for the United States. That sense of joy in our own tradition is very, very rare. Even among, so-called conservatives, they never seem very joyful about anything.
I don't know what you think about this, but to me, it's clear that the kind of conservative / Republican Party is going through its own sort of reformation / split. There's kind of the old neocons that despise Milo and try and distance themselves from people like Milo. And then there's the newer, generally younger people who are kind of just, Milo's funny and he has a lot of great points. So let's listen to him.
Yes, well, he's disrupt. I mean, he's just, I compared him to a variety of characters, like the Kung Fu Panda was another one. That, Francis was quite threatening, as was Jesus, right? If you think about Francis's model, because you're coming in and you're saying to the establishment, you're ridiculous, right? And you're ridiculous because you're not living by your own standards. And, Milo has made, it's like he's made the gay lobby even more, enormously angry, because he'll say things like, it's not necessarily the best thing in the world to be gay. I wouldn't want my own child to be gay. And they, don't like that, because they've spent decades trying to convince everyone that being gay is even better than having children. And, Milo will point to the ways in which there are moral truths in, things that people have been scared out of being able to speak anymore. And the powers that be don't like that. The people that have made their careers off of supporting certain issues from a particular perspective don't want him out there making them look ridiculous.
So you heard it here. Dr. Brown called Milo Jesus, and we will repeat that over and over again and say that.
Wasn't that was one of their accusations about you, I think.
He's imitating Jesus. I'm imitating Mary. What's the question?
I saw that he recently said, it's funny you're pointing out that your first thing that you went to was humor and laughter, because I find him very funny. And I saw he recently said he's kind of going to move away from politics a bit and focus on comedy, which I'm like, I think part of the reason people had such a problem with him is that he's a lot of things at once. And so I'm like, oh, well, if he focuses on comedy for a while, I think it'll be easier for people to see that humor part, because they get confused when it's like, I'm funny and I do comedy, but I do political commentary, but I also do this. And then it's like, they can't tell those things apart. I don't
Well,
know.
you're never going to be able to pigeonhole him in one place. That's the whole point, right? He
Yeah.
stays on the edge. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he's called himself a provocateur. I think that's an accurate description. But he seems to get that it's a culture war rather than a political war. So I don't imagine that he's going to abandon culture. He doesn't talk about politics all that much. It's usually culture that he seems to talk about.
Right. I mean, even when he was talking about politics, it was usually at a cultural level. So he's never been terrifically, because politics is, getting elected to particular offices and then having to decide how to use people's money. Right. And what he cares about is, art and, cultural things like the institution of the family and education. That's why he and I have, been friends, because what we also care about Christianity and the understanding of the faith. And that's a level that affects people's political behavior, but it's not as such political. Although, with my argument about the medieval towns, it's all of a piece, right? You have to understand that the economic and political and legal structures depend upon a certain understanding of your relationship to God.
Yeah, the thing that I'm learning from you is that things are a lot more complex and interwoven than any of the narratives that I've heard from either side.
Oh, good. Because they are.
I'm going to have a long reading list to do after this conversation. You mentioned that Milo changed your mind about Trump. So at one point you were you were in the anti-Trump camp. What did he do to change your mind about Trump?
So at the time that I wrote 3 Cheers for White Men, I think one of the context for it was that I was about to go on the National Review cruise that summer. And so I was sort of feeling like dangerous at that. I was like, little did I know what was coming, right? That even reading National Review was considered out, on the edge in 2015 for me. And I realized I was ready to start making some more public statements. Obviously, National Review is very anti-Trump editorially, and I was, still politically less informed on all of the players at when the election, the primary started. But a very interesting thing happened even before I was starting to listen to Milo. Was I was reading the coverage about Trump during the primary year, so 2015, 2016, and over and over and over again, although I still wasn't sure about him, what I was sure about was that the people who were supporting him were being vilified by the National Review and all of my friends in academia. And I warmed more to Trump supporters before I warmed to Trump, which I found interesting. But by the time I wrote to Milo, I was already, perfectly happy to be voting for Trump. And some of my posts around that same time, I think one of them right before I wrote about, the first one I wrote about Milo was, the joke was going around about Trump and Mrs. Clinton being likened to Gilderoy Lockhart and Umbridge, the headmistress in the Harry Potter stories, like both evil wizards, right? And I did a post on how funny I found this meme, and I got so much pushback from friends. I said, "How can you compare Mrs. Clinton to a horrible witch?" And I'm like, "Well, did you notice both? Both of this meme is making fun of both of them." But so even before I was friends with Milo, I was already going to be voting for Trump. But he didn't change me on that, but he certainly encouraged me to enjoy it a lot.
Well, certainly one thing that sets Trump apart from actually in my memory of every political candidate that I can think of, or presidential candidate, is he actually seems to be fighting a cultural war, not a political war. Like he's not really a conservative by many definitions, but he certainly triggers the mainstream media, which is a sure sign that he's fighting some kind of war, and that I think that is the cultural war.
So one of the things that I failed yet to get Milo to be interested in is when I was in college, one of my two favorite comic strips was Bloom County. Are you all aware of Bloom County?
I'm not.
I remember it. Yeah.
Okay. So it was the artist originally drew for the Austin campus newspaper, and it was in Texas. I was in Texas, right? And the characters live in a little boarding house that's modeled on a house that's on the University of Texas at Austin campus. And one of the main characters, which I found totally prophetic once I remembered this, is a reporter named Milo. Which I feel like the only other person in my life who's been named Milo is this cartoon character in Bloom County, right? So Milo is the reporter who goes around with his grandfather hunting liberals, right? Which is also funny. And in one of the sequences of the strip, Bill the cat, who's the awful sort of hairball retching tabby cat, or orange tabby cat. He was a Garfield spoof, right? Garfield the cat spoof. Let's see, they transplant Donald Trump's brain into the cat, right? Because Trump is like on a boat, he's sunbathing under a yacht, and the yacht runs over him, and somehow his brain is transplanted into the cat. Okay, so there's this long-running joke about Trump being in the cat, and you can say that even back in the 80s, Trump was clearly already culturally significant enough that Burt Breathitt had to put him in his cartoon. Fast forward to the primaries, Breathitt stopped writing Bloom County, say around 88, 89. He brought it back to cover Trump in the election year, right? It was very interesting. It's like Trump was the only thing that could bring Bloom County back as a comic strip. And there's some very, very funny comic strips in that series about Trump as political candidate. That, to me, point one, it's the significance of how Trump taps into people's, understanding of the absurd in our cultural moment. And two, that Breathitt himself as a cartoonist could see that. Nobody else, none of the Bushes, none of, even Obama excited him to start drawing the cartoon again, but Trump did.
Did he keep Trump in the cat?
No, when he came back, he was himself.
Okay.
But wearing like dogs as toupees, I think. The Shih Tzus, the Lhasa Apsos lose their hair, or I can't remember it. But anyway, the Milo character in Bloom County was the reporter was pretty funny to me. Milo has yet to acknowledge that he likes that or not. I keep sending him the strips.
Speaking of Milo, he's had a lot. He's been, I think, was he part of the last YouTube purge or demonetization? He had some videos taken down. I saw some old videos. Like, right. A lot of people had old things taken down, right?
His YouTube channel's still there. He was kicked off Facebook completely, though.
Right. For what? I don't remember. Who knows what the reason was? I don't remember.
He said so he's on Telegram now, if you want to follow him. He was saying today that he found out that it was because he participated in the Tommy Robinson rally last summer. I think it doesn't matter. It's an excuse, right? But they're claiming that because he was associated with Tommy Robinson, that was sufficient reason to take him off. They're just using whatever they want to make it sound justified.
So because you're associated with him, when do you come down?
I don't know, right? I don't know.
That's how this works now, right? So
yeah.
Yes, you always think, I've done nothing to, well, yeah, right. It doesn't matter. I hadn't done nothing. I had said 3 cheers for white men, and I got called a fascist.
Yeah, well, that's a total Nazi thing to say.
3 cheers for anybody is a total Nazi thing to say. I think you're celebrating someone.
Yeah, stop.
Envy kicks in.
Yeah, exactly. Someone's happy somewhere.
Right. Yes. Someone's happy somewhere. Better call them a Nazi.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't want to circle back to history a little bit, but I'm thinking about this. You mentioned John Milton in one of your articles about freedom of speech, kind of the origins of freedom of speech. Mm-hmm. And I think your point was, one of your points, it was how freedom of speech and freedom of religion were kind of the same thing. At one point, because it was the freedom to worship differently or talk about God or criticize a religion differently. And something that struck me as interesting was you make the argument. So John Milton compares destroying books to homicide, and destroying, like a lot of books, basically genocide, which is really interesting given modern times. I'm sure he would argue that, taking down YouTube channels is murder. Basically. But he also seemed to understand that correct me if I'm wrong, because I just want to clarify. It seemed that Milton understood that this was about culture, not politics, which I think is the point you're making also. That censorship is a cultural problem, not a political problem.
So what you're referring to is Areopagitica, which is an argument. It's technically an argument against having censors for the press, right? And he makes the very good argument. I think this is also pertinent in the YouTube purges. Who's going to be doing the censoring, right? And who are you going to trust more than the philosophers who are making the arguments to figure out whether the philosophers' arguments are worth banning or not? And his point being, what government functionary is going to be basically smarter than the authors of the text themselves, that you're obviously not going to have as the government functionary someone who's as smart as the authors, because otherwise they'd be writing their own work. Right. And I think that is definitely, we've got the algorithms going through and taking down videos that are educational about the Nazis, as well as taking down videos that are presumably promoting being a Nazi, although I don't know if there are any of those. That the capacity to critique is itself one of the higher functions. And, those who are able to make complicated arguments are often misunderstood. How are you you're not going to have any complexity in any of your discussions if you're just going to leave it all up to the censors to decide what we can talk and think about.
That seems like a generalizable argument to against kind of central authority in planning generally beyond censorship, right?
Yes. Although ironically, where we are now is, of course, there was a excellent piece by Victor Davis Hanson in American Greatness this morning on the way in which what's happening is a uprising of the middle class and the lower class against the managerial elite, right? And to a certain extent, that managerial elite has been created by the universities, and that was a purposeful program from particularly in the United States since the 1960s, with the people like Robert McNamara and so forth that are, we're going to be, although it obviously goes back to the progressive era too, it's layers and layers of generations of this. We are going to have the experts with their quantitative assessments figure out exactly what the best society is going to be, and we're going to engineer that. And that what we're watching with the populist nationalist uprisings against this globalist bureaucracy is the revolt against those who have considered themselves intellectually elite. But obviously, from my perspective, many of those people are
they're not intellectuals.
They're not intellectuals. They're certainly not able to deal with, Milo's jokes or my pointing out that, you all are really not representing terrifically well the complexity of our own field in our scholarship. And, it's a middle management takeover, the middle management that decides all the censoring, and those like, Milo who don't seem to fit in any categories. Even, we're talking about, is he more culture? Is he more politics? Well, the problem is, you're dealing with a network of, it's not a network, it's this, a phrase that Milo always likes is intricate symbiosis. And I always think it's not quite it either. There's something about the complexity of a culture that is never going to be something that you can censor one part of efficiently to protect everybody from the dangerous stuff.
It's an ecosystem in some sense, where anything you do does affect everything else that you do.
Yes, maybe that's the ecosystem is a better image.
Which is something I think the leftists, it's one of their classic mistakes often, is the assumption that I'm going to change some policy and no one will change their behavior at all, and this is what the result will be. What, do you not know what humans do? I don't understand.
Right. Well, they say it's like, if we put up a wall, people will climb it, and you're like, well, yeah. So, if you institute some kind of program, people will figure out how to game it.
Right.
What the thing that made Milo's reporting transition from reporter at Catholic Herald to tech editor at Breitbart was his interest in Gamergate. we're dealing with creatures who are really, really interested in strategizing and beating systems.
Yep.
What are you going to do? You should, revel in the game, I think, more than thinking that somehow you're going to create the perfect set of laws that will prevent people from misbehaving ever. That's ridiculous.
Right. Well, I mean, we could try the Soviet Union all over again. Are you up for
Right.
Holodomor 2? Here we go.
However, there is an answer that's better than, totalitarian repression. And that is going back, you say, where does Western civilization come from? It comes from the training in virtue that medieval Europeans developed over the course of centuries. And that is specifically what I'm working on now to, in my teaching and my starting to try to figure out where you can even read about something that is so general and yet so deeply embedded in people's everyday lives that it's very hard to even appreciate it when you don't have it. But it is what we're seeing with the immigration of people from other cultures who do not behave in the ways that we expect them to, because they've never been trained by their own culture to, have certain expectations about how people interact, including to the level of how you behave as men and women.
Yeah,
and
no,
chivalry, therefore, is absolutely critical. If you don't think it's important, then I don't know what to say.
No, you're right. I think, which is why, there are a lot of people that just say like, oh, I have a friend who's very interested in like changing the Constitution to fix a few things. And I don't want to be a fatalist, but I view politics like a political system as an emergent property of a culture. So it doesn't matter what you write on a piece of paper. It matters what culture is. And they'll ignore the paper. They ignore the paper now. What makes you think changing a few sentences will make them not ignore those sentences? That's what needs to change, is the culture. It's
magical thinking. And this is at the root of this is the difference between people who believe in prayer and people who believe in magic.
Oh, I like that.
Okay. So people who believe in magic think that if you say the spell exactly correctly, if you do all the right motions, if you make the ritual perfect, you'll get a particular result, right? And it's sort of control. It's a control, right? It's a desire for control and a desire to have a specific outcome. SJW warriors are witches for the most part, satanic, right? But in the sense that they think that if they get everything exactly right, they can control it. Prayer recognizes you put yourself in the willingness for certain things to happen. You ask for help, prepare yourself with all the skills that you need, and know that it isn't entirely under your control that things are going to turn out in a particular way, including if you want to like make something beautiful, right? That's why we talk about art being inspired, right? It's something that you're not always sure where that thought or image or melody or the perfect movement comes from. Prayer leaves yourself open to the possibility of inspiration and grace. Magic wants to be in control and coerce.
Yes. I love this analogy. I was gonna say I love this analogy because it's given me a lot to think about, but we talk about a lot about how when I was in SJW, I didn't so much I wasn't thinking a lot. I wasn't thinking. I was sorting through everything I knew, like all the tenets of the belief system, to pick the right words, the correct words to express the ideology correctly. And that's almost like an incantation. It's like incantations. And they will use certain phrases like as magic spells to end the conversation. It's like toxic masculinity, done.
Yes.
That's why they hate Milo, because their spells don't work.
Their spells don't work on him.
Their spells don't work.
Yeah.
And the thing is, their spells work on most people. Their spells on most people, you could say they cast this fear, right? And then you can't even see that there's nothing there, right? There's nothing there to be afraid of. You just step into it. It evaporates, right? It's a glamour. It's a fiction, but the spells are so effective, they do terrify people. And what I've continued to find is, at least in this social context, right, if you can answer them with joy and laughter, it goes away.
You actually talk a lot about, you actually give Trigglypuff psychological advice, which I think is hilarious. But you write somewhere that you say, I have a theory. People get anxious when they don't know where the ideas that they are asked to live by come from. And I've never heard anyone say something like that, but I think it's brilliant. Can you expound upon that a little bit? Because it really resonates with me, and I feel like I haven't thought about it enough, but I feel like that's what's happening with the social justice warriors.
Yes, they're anxious. What I've been describing to you is, the Christian roots of all of their ideals, right? Because they're coming out of a historically Christian culture, and so they don't have the depth to appreciate why these things, deeply matter, right? They know they do, and they know socially they matter, and they know that in order to, maintain the approval of the group, they need to say those things. But pressed to defend them, they can't, because they actually haven't studied, as as a historian, I'd say they don't know the history of where those ideas come from. But then they also don't know why, certain values historically have been tested and found to, contribute more to the realization of the human soul than others. And I'd say, I mean, partly what I'm talking about is just as a historian, I'm fairly comfortable defending my ideas because I can give you a lineage for how that idea developed and why it has the entailments that it does.
Right. Worst case, it's sort of a heuristic.
Yes.
If you have that information, you're like, well, I know thousands of years of history and this works.
Right.
Okay.
Right. I'm great. It's like I'm deeply rooted. And that's why I say, whether I'm a conservative or, as I understand it politically, I should be better saying I'm a nationalist now, because conservatives don't really do anything. But you are.
By the way, the best description of conservatives I've ever heard is conservatives are progressives driving the speed limit, which comes from Michael.
Yes, that one's very good. We'll just go a little slower, but we'll still get in the same place eventually. And you're like, no, that truly conservative should be knowing the deep history of things. And doing what Chesterton suggests. If you want to take the wall away first, be able to explain why it's there in the first place, that you're able to understand why institutions developed which, it's not to say institutions need regular reform. It's a feature of being human. They fall, they decay, they fall away from their original purpose over generations. And so you have to reform them, but you do want to look at them and figure out why they were developed in the way that, it's instituted in the way they were in the first place. And then you can have some hope of reforming them.
There's one of your entries, I think it was maybe that Happy Warrior one, about where you were kind of giving advice for people who, if they're trying to get over their fear, like if you're going to wade into the fray and if you're going to get over your fear of these magic spells, for example, what are some lessons that you have learned in having these conversations with people I call SJWs, and being the target of spells and ad hominem attacks and all of that? Like, what are some of those lessons in that entry that you gave? Because I thought you had a pretty great list of things.
I think there were 10, and I'm not sure I can remember all 10 of them, but
okay.
And the first one is know everything, right? That you really do want to read widely. And the more you know, the more confident you'll feel when people come at you with, well, what do you think about this? And you're like, well, I think this is, that and also to be able to say, when people come at you with questions about an issue that you haven't considered, you say, I don't know. I haven't read about that yet.
Yes.
Right. It's like, you're not obliged to know everything. And, the things that you are interested in understanding, read well, right? Read widely. That I also am giving some advice on, learning to school your emotions. And you all said very nicely earlier that I seem fearless. What I am is practiced at dealing with being afraid. And that came from, in practical terms, just from being a fencer, and the years of fencing bear before I made 3 Cheers for White Men are about my frustration at competition and tournaments, and living through that fear of failure, right? Because truly, in the end of the day, at a fencing tournament, only one person wins. Everybody else has been beaten at some point, because it's elimination. It's an elimination tree, right? And so, understanding what it takes to take the hit, take the loss, get back up, watch what it is that the fencers who are still in the competition are able to do, understand why you got knocked out, and work through that, right? Particularly if you're someone like myself who's used to winning in other venues, right? Like I always got good grades, right? So in effect, getting an F on the fencing strip was pretty traumatic for me. I didn't know how to cope with failure, literal failure, like getting knocked out instantly. And that's when in the post for Trigglypuff, when I'm saying, learn to sit with your anxieties, learn to sit with the things that make you uncomfortable. You do need to be able to do that so that when people come at you with these attacks and are trying to trigger your emotions, you know what that feels like. You know what being under attack feels like, and you know how to be calm through it. Another very important of the lessons is always respect your opponent. And that, of course, is something the SJWs don't want you to do, but they do have a position, they do have things that they're concerned about. Not SJWs tend to want to talk things through. They don't necessarily, but recognize that you don't get to have a conversation at all if you don't have someone who's opposing you. So in a fencing bout, we salute each other and then recognize that you want to bring your best game to the strip to draw out each other's strengths, right? You want a strong opponent so that you have to fence hard. I'd say temperamentally, that's probably one of the things that distinguishes SJWs from not SJWs, is not SJWs are willing to compete. SJWs just, it seems to me in my experience with you, want to bully you into giving up, which is not the same thing.
Well, that's because they'll lose in a fair competition, but that's
right.
a separate. I mean, you're talking about these rules, which I think are good, but you also then talked about Saul Alinsky's rules about how the other side actually has been winning winning the culture war, or what they have been doing. I don't want to walk through all of Saul Alinsky's rules. I don't think I could, but are there a few that you want to tell people about to recognize? Because I don't think regular people understand that, so Hillary Clinton did her thesis on Saul Alinsky, and his rules for radicals is widely read and adopted by all of these activists. And they're kind of disconcerting if you read them.
Again, I don't think I can rehearse all of them, but the most famous one is the pick a target, personalize it, and just go after it. And you can see that's definitely the way all of those of us on the right have been attacked. I mean, me, right? It's like they picked me as a target, personalized me as the demon to come after, signed letters against me, called me names in conferences, worried about making sure I didn't show up at conferences and so forth. It's the way they're taking out the individual players, like Milo first, right? But then in the YouTube purge just recently, trying to take out people like Steven Crowder, even that they keep it personal, so that, and the wrong response is, as Milo and I and Milo and I and our friends have been trying to show, is like, once you took Milo out and nobody stood up for him, you've given the game up, right? Because you have shown the left that the personalizing attack of the individuals one at a time is going to work, because each other individual will pretend and hope that, well, they won't come for me if I just don't side with that one.
Right.
Which is the exact opposite of what we should be doing.
Out, you're done.
Yeah.
Right. And you write about that. You say, cut off the support network and isolate the target from sympathy. Go after people and not institutions. Hurt people faster than institutions. I mean, it's a vicious tactic, but it's effective because they make an example out of you. So your colleagues see you and they're like, I don't want to go through that crap. I'm just going to shut up.
Right.
But that's exact wrong. I totally agree with you and Milo about this. It's the exact wrong thing to do, because they're not going to not come for you if you stay quiet. They're going to come for you eventually. The only thing to do is for everyone to stand up, is to support those people who've been unpersoned. I mean, even if their views are, you find them to be odious and like someone that you would never agree with, it's like, but you have to have that that principle of like, I support the free speech, and I support free expression for everyone. And to do otherwise is just, I think it's like to stick your head in the sand and not to realize that it will catch up with you.
Right. And now, I mean, now they're playing this sort of milkshake game, right? Which is actual violence, right?
Yeah.
Fine.
Well,
It's
milkshakes is the
violence.
nice end of that violence. I mean, my friend was
Right.
beaten up and pepper sprayed and everything else at a Milo
Exactly.
event. So,
Oh, the one at Berkeley?
yeah, yeah. In fact, they moved. Her husband was beat up. She was pepper sprayed and beaten over the head.
I know who you're talking about. I'm in touch with her. Yes.
Let's not say her name, but
I'm not going to.
yeah.
But I know who you're talking about, and I think I'm happy we're in touch.
Yeah, no, she's one of my best friends, but I mean, she would have loved to just have a milkshake thrown on her.
Yes. No, well, the thing is, I mean, she's in touch with me, but I'd seen the video already, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a very
the
famous
milkshaking, the milkshaking
video who's in Chicago with you, another friend.
Well, but I mean, the problem is these are real people who are being attacked, right? They're not monsters. They're not,
Right.
accidental extras. They're your friends.
Yes. Yeah. And they were just there because one of them actually didn't even really know Milo very much. She was just like, I'm curious, what is this guy about? I'm going to go to the event.
Right.
And she got up.
Right.
one thing about the milkshakes though, that I heard someone talking about today, I can't remember, it might've been Tim Pool. It's just that they've already, if they start with something that seems silly like that, like milkshakes,
Right.
and then people are like, it's just milkshakes. Like, I thought you guys were against snowflakes, why are you being such a snowflake? But I've seen the media, like the legacy, the corporate media, just like sort of justifying this as something that should be done. And then to borrow a word from SJWs, you normalize this idea that it's okay to use physical violence against someone who disagrees with you, if it's a silly, fun physical violence. But then it becomes easier to take that next step. And as people were pointing out today, there are already people making jokes about throwing acid.
Mm-hmm. No, I know. it is genuinely frightening because they are truly, literally normalizing violence.
Absolutely.
And that the irony, the horrible irony of their claiming that your words are violence. So, I can use any violence against you. And it's like, no, our words are arguments that are meant to, work through to solutions to difficult social problems that we have about, again, how to live together in community. And to go back to the medieval towns, right, that we even worry about things like citizenship and borders. Towns have borders, they have walls. You have responsibilities if you want to be a citizen and live within those walls and have the privileges of being a citizen. And what happens over the course of early modern history is you extend that idea of citizenship to the nation, which then has borders that you recognize as the entire country. That to put a wall up, I did a blog post that it sounds like you all have read very deeply in the archive. There's a post on I Will Be a Wall for Them, which is a meditation on the imagery of the wall from the Middle Ages, and particularly the Virgin Mary is a wall. Specifically in some of the texts that I worked with for my first book, that protects the Jews, right? That the town walls, the walls of those towns that I talked about that were attacked by the Imiko of Leiningen in the First Crusade, the Jews that were not killed were the ones that were able to take refuge within the walls of the city, and the bishop could protect them appropriately. And Speyer had walls that was able to protect the people, and so the Crusaders moved on to another town that didn't have sufficiently robust walls. You want protection. Walls are not, they're not aggressive. They're protective.
Can I circle back to, I want to pull a thread that you left hanging before.
Okay.
You mentioned something about institutions and understanding where they come from. And yes, sometimes they need reform. And I totally agree. I think, you need to know why we have what we have before you can criticize it effectively. That said, universities, right now, you're a university professor, and to me, universities have gotten so rotten. There's very few people like you at universities, right? They're so rotten. Then, as I think of my child growing up, she's probably, 7, 8 years away from going to a university, if she goes to a university. I think, like, how can I justify sending her there? There's so much online. There's so many other opportunities to learn. It seems like I feel like I'd be sending her to, it'd be like saying, you need to go check out the Soviet Union for 4 years. It's like, is that really necessary? Can they be reformed? Because they seem like the source of a lot of this evil.
Well, yes, they can be reformed. What that will take is another question. But so what I've been asked this question before, and I said, well, the corollary is to think about the history of monasteries as institutions, and how throughout the Middle Ages, about every 100 years, there were major reform movements. Starting from antiquity. In the High Middle Ages, you have the Cistercians who are trying to reform, the Benedictines who've been reformed in the 10th century. The Cistercians are then reformed effectively by Francis and Dominic in the 13th century. There's further reforms later. That as the towns developed, as the society became more complex, different solutions arose to the question of what does it mean to live a religious life, to teach people Christian doctrine most effectively. I mean, we're obviously living through a massive transformation now. We're having this conversation on the internet. I am just now putting together a course that I'm going to be teaching online through the unauthorized TV that Vox Day is starting. And I put together the website for it. It's called it's unauthorized medieval history.blogspot.com, and you can get all the supporting materials there. And then there'll be videos with me talking through various things however it's going to develop. I got to get the first video thought through and get it out there. That, how we can translate this kind of medium into new forms of education is going to, be pretty exciting over the next few years. What your daughter is going to experience in 7 or 8 years, who knows, right? Who knows what kinds of media and genres we're going to have developed in the next few years. Education should be a dynamic and practical thing. You should keep trying out new ways of learning. And, that's why I disagree with, so-called conservative colleagues, if there were any left, that, want to go back to, the great books. And I'm like, well, which great books? One of the pages that I have on the blog is a list of all the great books that everybody always leaves out from the Middle Ages. By
the way, I loved your argument about this, which was, you said we go from like high point to high point to high point, but we miss like the real story of what was going on from the average citizen, and from their perspective. And
right.
I had great books were a great idea until I read that blog post, and I was like, oh, that's a much better way to study history. That makes a lot of sense to me. So thank you for that.
So education should be an art as well as a craft, and there's no perfect practice. There's you try things and you keep training. It's saddens me that over the years that I've been in academia, I've regularly been suggesting new things to try as assignments, or I have blogs that I have my students write papers on for my courses, because I find if they write to a real audience, they write better. And they do reflections on the discussions that we have. I'm very experimental in the different kinds of research projects that I give them. And I don't do it because it's nice if it makes me popular, but I do it because I'm trying out different pedagogical problems. Right. And I would say I come from a long line of teachers. I like to say I'm all for women's education. My great grandmother graduated from college in Arkansas in the late 19th century. So,
wow.
And
she was the one,
they all became teachers, right? So maybe it's just, it's in my lineage that me and my female ancestors, we keep trying to become better teachers always.
Yeah.
This
Do you
makes
think
me
the
very
universities
excited
are-
because
Go
I
ahead.
was gonna say, this makes me very excited because um, one of the things that this all my old belief system did to me in a way, or that I let it do to me, is that I kind of became very incurious. Is that is that even a word? Yes. But I just recently started, I realized when I started coming out of this belief system, like how little I knew, like Keri was saying earlier, about history, about philosophy, and YouTube has just been pretty great about giving me access to different professors, lectures, and people are starting to upload this. And so I find this really exciting. So I'm like, oh, you can continue to learn, no matter at what point you come back to that desire to want to read and to discover new things. Like the fact that it's going to be at our fingertips makes me very happy. That I don't have to go to enroll in some institution and pay a huge fee.
Well, that's my question, really, though. Do you think universities will reform within themselves, or do you think they'll be replaced by something else, like the new university? What's your, if you had to guess?
Both will happen, because I mean, if I use my monastic model, there were Benedictines throughout the Middle Ages, right? Those houses continued, but then when the new orders came, the Benedictines had to reform themselves and rethink exactly who they thought they were. And one of the last great reforms in the Middle Ages is a Benedictine reform. So it's the observant reform. So I'd say, the competition is good, because it means that you think through what your best practices are, what your institution is good at, what kinds of things you would like to do more effectively. Hopefully we get some good competition. I mean, I think, for example, if I do my course well, it's not that it means nobody wants to come to study with me at the University of Chicago. It means, of the many people who watch my videos or, take up my reading suggestions from the blog, some of them will want to come work with me in person, right? So, the working with people in person is always a luxury, because we're, physically limited. And, for example, I do fiddle classes at Old Town School of Folk Music in Chicago. And, I could theoretically learn the fiddle all by myself, just watching YouTube videos, but I go to class, and I have to drive, uptown to get there and so forth. And it's worth my time, because it's worth my time being taught by an actual person. So it doesn't mean that the universities all collapse and we only do online teaching. It means, there become different ways of learning added. Hopefully that's what I'd see, that hopefully it adds to the different kinds of practices that people can develop.
One of the things I like that's happening right now because the universities are kind of unstable and people are looking at them askance, you really like the Simon Sinek why questions, like starting with why. I also love that. It was part of, I was in the startup community for a long time. It's one of the, find your why is a common trope to tell founders. But I think we haven't been asking the question about education lately, which is why. Like, why are you going? We've kind of turned going into university as a thing you're supposed to do, but we haven't asked the question like why. Why are you going there? What do you? What's the purpose? What do you hope to accomplish out of going to university? And I think if we ask those questions, we'd probably teach things a little bit differently, and possibly some different subjects.
So I mentioned that I did a variety of courses when I was in college for my religious studies degree, and one was an ethics course. And the paper that I did for that course was on the corruption of using academia as a credentialing mechanism, which is what it is, right? It's basically social status. And, the fact that you get an education at the elite institutions is largely accidental to their social purpose, which is credentialing status. And that's what Charles Murray was pointing out in his coming apart, that the liberal elite is defined by the meritocracy of university selection, and you want your children to get into the top universities. It's much more a social thing than anything else. And what could happen and will be interesting to happen is, like, say Milo has come around, and Milo and the other content creators on YouTube and so forth, and are crushing the mainstream journalists and news media, right?
Yep,
It's just like
absolutely.
there's nothing left of their credibility and authority. That could happen with universities. I think it probably won't take out the truly elite schools like Harvard, maybe Chicago, but taking out the sort of credentialing status of a university degree. I already feel it. The number of times that this crazy person who's a professor has been reported on in the media. It's like, oh my gosh, who wants to be a professor anymore? There's no status in that. That I think that will be interesting to see how that plays out as a social transformation.
Well, I can say as someone who's hired a number of engineers in the past 20 years, the value of an engineering degree has gone to just about zero. It's show me your GitHub repository, show me what you've done, come in and work on some stuff. I mean, some of our best hires in the past have been, a guy who dropped out of high school, a guy who lied his way into college because he, was arrested, like all this, but they were autodidacts and they were really good at what they did. And, I see that in fields where it's easy to measure skill, but in some other fields, maybe more difficult. And that's when you kind of want to rely on a credential somehow. So we'll see.
Yes. Well, I mean, history is one of those tricky ones, because how do you tell when someone's giving you the true story? Right. And the credentialing of peer review and, the scholarly lineage and, sort of the testing of historical knowledge. Yes. I mean, that's one of the things I'm hoping to show in my online course is how do you go about reading a historical source to even answer those questions? And in that sense, it's kind of a guild apprenticeship that you have to go through to become a historian, that you have to be trained as an undergraduate and a graduate student in the craft, right? And as you say, those things are harder to test. You can't, you could test people's knowledge of dates and things, and you do need to know dates because you need to be able to think in an orderly way and order your narrative and your evidence and so forth. But that doesn't of itself tell you whether someone's making a good argument.
And it seems like maybe you're mentioning the kind of craft model. Maybe instead of caring about what university someone came from, it's kind of, well, who was their mentor? Like, well, I was trained by this person and that person is recognized. And so like, oh, you're in their mentorship cohort. Okay. I'll assume, because they have a reputation that matters. I guess I'm not sure exactly how that might work. And it seems like that's how universities are supposed to be. It's just that they've lost their credibility as a university.
Well, to a certain extent, they still are. I mean, and it's like, that's when you go to graduate school, you look for particular people to study with. So there's a balance between, as undergraduates, the prestige of the institution is the thing that you mainly focus on. With graduate students, you're looking at the prestige of the institution, but you're also looking at the people that you would be studying with.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's a complicated system, and it's a complicated status. I get to go, stand in robes tomorrow at graduation. and it's always a nice meditation for me on the, I love the ceremony because I'm, a medievalist and I like ritual. But there's also the sort of, it's a kind of, and it's also a celebration for the students because they work very hard to get the degree, and you want that degree to be valuable to them. You want the work to have meant something, to, be a good, true marker of intellectual accomplishment. But there's also the flip side of it. It's like, exactly what does this pomp and ceremony prove? It doesn't prove, it's meant to be celebratory, right? But, and I think, we do need as a culture moments in which we celebrate people's accomplishments, like rites of passage.
No, absolutely. It's even good for just building up habits personally, is to celebrate your successes and, give yourself a pat on the back when you reinforce good behavior, basically. So,
right.
This might be a good segue to a question that I think is probably unanswerable, but you're the best person to ask, so I'm going to ask it anyway. So I'm a dad. I have a 10-year-old, and I'm strongly considering pulling her out of. She goes to private school, but even that is crap. We're in the Bay Area, so it's all intersectionality and whatever.
Mm.
And I've been experimenting with other methods of teaching her stuff, and I'm strongly considering pulling her out for next year and just homeschooling. And one of the big heartburns I have is I started to look at different curriculums available. And I have a tech background, so I'm not worried about any of the science or math. I can do all that. She's an avid reader. We can do all that. We can write. That's all fine. History is something that confounds me because I'm scared to just go get a history book on a subject because I don't trust the accuracy or the narrative or the ideology behind the authors of educational books for junior high school and high schoolers anymore, and even college and beyond. I know that's not your forte, but one thing that I could start with would be educating myself, but I don't even really know who to trust. I want an objective, I know no one's perfectly objective, but I want an objective, not ideologically driven overview of history. I don't even know where to start. Right?
Well, you could talk for American history. Larry Schweikart and Michael Allen's A Patriot's History is actually a good read.
Okay.
So you'll probably enjoy that. You might want to tune into my online course a little bit. And if you haven't already looked at that blog, look over those pages. That the way I teach is with primary sources, right? That you're trying to learn to read the things that were written at the time and understand how every source is always framed by the author's need to make an argument in the moment, right? Most of my teaching at the undergraduate level is all through primary sources. The challenge is obviously getting the habit of questions. So what do you need to consider in order to know how well you can trust this representation of the moment? And that's the real craft of becoming a historian, that no amount of reading, sort of grand overviews is going to solve for you, because you won't know how to trust those grand overviews if you don't know what kinds of sources they're drawing on and how they've synthesized them and made an argument from those.
To me, by the way, I like that idea of just training myself to be able to figure out how to read primary material and understand what matters and what doesn't, perspectives.
And so that's, I'm going to be concentrating on medieval problems in the course, but the method is the one that, we try to get the students to understand, that you have to learn to trust the primary sources, not depend on a textbook or a big survey to give you the final answer, right? It's like it's like a giant puzzle that you're always trying to find more pieces on. And so to a certain extent, it makes no difference where you start. You just should start somewhere. And that's obviously why people like the Great Book series, because they're sort of comforting in the sense of these are recommended books. And you can start with some of those. The Great Books of the Western World series that was produced here is heavily classics and modernity. It almost leaves out the Middle Ages completely. Dr. Eliot's 5-Foot Shelf, the Harvard Classics, is it's somewhat more literary, and but it still shifts to the modern quite a lot. But there's good books in it, right? So you read those. It's people want history to be like learning mathematics and have a sort of logical structure of operations to work through. It's not. It's layering of stories, right? You read a story, you come back to it later, you reread something that puts a piece there that shifts that perspective. So you just have to get a habit of reading to sustain.
Okay.
As well as the methodology for thinking about how to understand the primary sources.
Well, I like that answer. I think I might sign up for your thing when it's on unauthorized TV. Keri, do you have anything to add?
I just want to say thank you for coming on our program. And I'm a big fan. And I was nervous at the beginning, but I don't feel nervous anymore.
Oh, good. Well, thank you both for reading so much in the blog. I appreciate it.
This was a great conversation, and honestly, I wish that I wish I had read more. There's first of all, you're very prolific. You write.
You're very prolific, and also allow me to make a little dig. One more dig at this woman who's led this mob against you. One of the things you talked about this ideology coming from like being satanic, and that it is all about attacking creation.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of resentment in this ideology. There's a lot of jealousy, and that's why they attack, in a way, the creation. They attack creators. And if you just look at this woman's, if you look at how prolific you are and the amount of work that you put into your writing, and then you compare it to this person who's trying to tear you down, I'm like, it's pretty obvious to me, and to me anyway, my opinion, what is motivating some of this. So this is me taking a little dig, but but it's definitely, there's something there about just about hating. There's something in the belief system about hating the results of good work, of hard work.
It's hating the good for being the good.
Yeah.
Which I think is what Dr. Brown is saying is Satan.
Yes. That's what I mean.
So, well, Dr. Brown, thank you again. This was an awesome conversation. I kind of want to just hang out and have dinner with you for 4 days. But I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for taking the time to be with us, and hopefully we can have you back in the future.
Great. Thank you for having me.